We're studying Genesis this morning, and we are talking about Noah. Bible Biographies is the subtitle for this lesson, and we're going to look at Noah's life and what Genesis has to tell us about it. So we'll start at chapter 5 and verse 29. Chapter 5 of Genesis and verse 29, where we're told about Noah's birth, and this is what it says. Well, I guess we'll start in 28 to get the context of Lamech being his dad. Lamech lived 182 years, and he became the father of a son. Excuse me. And he called his name Noah, saying, "This one will give us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands arising from the ground, which the Lord has cursed." So that's what Noah's dad said when he was born. Going to name this boy Noah because he's going to give us some rest. He's going to give us comfort, which is what the name means, from the work of our hands. And in talking about the work of our hands, what did he mention in regard to that? He mentioned the ground which the Lord had cursed. When did God curse the ground, and why did he curse the ground? Cain. Well, Cain was the second sin, but who was the first sin? Adam. Adam was the first sin, and that was part of the curse on Adam and for all humanity at that point, that God would curse the ground and it would not produce as it has in the garden, or as it had in the garden, and it would produce thorns and thistles. Anybody who's ever had a garden, you know what it's like. You got to get out there and you got to pull weeds and you got to keep out the bad stuff. Of course, what is said about weeds? Weeds are simply plants whose virtues have not yet been discovered. Anybody ever had a salad made out of dandelions? Okay, or violets, or, well, there's all kinds of greens out there. I can't think of the name. It's a funny name. Poke. I used to say poke salads. What did I used to say? I don't know, but y'all, you know what? Oh, it's the other word, poke salad, because it's S-A-L-A-T. But I thought it was poke salad when I was a kid because, well, duh, you make it into a salad anyway. Actually, you boil it, but I think you can eat it while it's tender and young, too, without boiling it. But there's a lot of stuff out there. Why am I talking about this? I don't need to go on about this. Anyway, that's where the curse came from. And so when Lamech had this boy, he said, this boy is going to give us comfort. And how prophetic was it? You got to wonder. But for whatever reason, God decided to include that fact, that historical fact of what Lamech said about his boy in the book of his word. So consider what he says. He was unique in his time. That's my line about Noah. It says in chapter 6 that he found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Look at verse 8. Chapter 6, verse 8. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Pretty straightforward, just one verse. But that's in, as the word goes, contradistinction. Don't you like that word? Contradistinction to everybody else in the world. The whole world was corrupt except for this one guy, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Why did God destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? I know we're jumping ahead in history here up to chapter 19, but he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah because of the sin that was so prevalent there. What deal did Abram try to make with God to save Sodom? Okay, if I can find 50 righteous people, and then what did Abram do? He came back and he changed the deal a little bit. What if I can perchance, oh Lord, what if there's just 40? And he worked him down to how many? 10. If I can find 10 righteous people, how many did he find? He apparently found only Lot, because he didn't have enough to make up 10. And I sort of chuckle in my mind when I think about this. How many people did God know were in Sodom when he was making that deal with Abram? He knew there weren't 10. And God did not go to Abram, Abram, forget it. There's not 10 righteous people there. I'm just going to wipe the place. God didn't do that. He let Abraham bargain with him for the souls of all those in Sodom based on the righteousness of 10 people being there, and there weren't. So here's the whole world And there's only one righteous man with his family. That's Noah. So he is in contradistinction to the rest of the world. He's a standout. He's a righteous man, also according to chapter 6, verse 9. What does it mean to be righteous? Under Jesus' covenant, what does it mean to be righteous? Here's a trick question. So don't raise your hand because it's a trick question. Is there anybody here who's righteous? Now see, we would not presume to raise our hands because we don't want people to think that we believe we are righteous of our own, and that's kind of what that question sounds like it's trying to answer. But if I ask you through Jesus Christ, how many here are righteous, how many of us could raise our hands? Even I could raise my hand through Jesus Christ, because under the new covenant, what does Jesus do to make us righteous? What does it teach us that he does? He takes our faith and he does what? He counts it, he reckons it as righteousness. That's Romans chapter 4. But that's not something brand new. That's something that God was doing. He mentions it first with Abram, but he was really doing it with Noah too. Because Noah was not a righteous man. He was just like every other man in the idea and the fact that he sinned. But his view was towards God. He put his faith in God. Hebrews will tell us that as well. And so God looks upon him as a righteous man. Noah has right in his mind, and he's trying to follow what is right. And so in God's mind, that makes him right. Questions, commentary on that? All right. He was also blameless in his time. Once again, chapter 6 and verse 9. What's it mean to be blameless? What is it that one comedian said? He said, I didn't say it was your fault. I said, I'm blaming you. Something like that, yeah. Because it's just handy to place the blame when something comes up. That's one of the reasons, I hate to say this, but that's one of the reasons I got out of the military. If anything bad went wrong, everybody down line from whoever it was that went wrong or up line was scared to death that they were going to get in trouble because that troop wasn't supervised the way he should have been. And it's like heads will roll. Well, when you got a problem, that shouldn't be the attitude because that just creates fear in everybody. And your motivation is not to fix things so that they are fixed and working right. Your motivation is, I don't want to get in trouble because he got in trouble. And so you start covering things up. And it's a bad system to work that way. So blame is something that's real. If you have a problem with your car, you want to know what's to blame. Why is it making that noise? Who in here has never had a car to make a noise that you were worried about? We want to know what's making that noise. And when you find it, you know, oh, there's the problem. Let's junk this car. No, there's the problem. Let's fix what is wrong. Noah was a guy who apparently in his life tried to fix what was wrong. There was nothing about him for which God would fix blame on him. And in all these things, we see the same way we should live. And then the next one, he walked with God. Also chapter 6, verse 9. These are the records of the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his time. Noah walked with God. What's it mean to walk with God? Amos, the prophet, will later ask a question in a different context, but his question will be, can two walk together unless they are, you remember? Agreed. You can't walk together with somebody unless you are in agreement, some kind of agreement with them. There was some kind of an agreement between God and Noah, and it was all based on God. Had to be. God wouldn't say, well, okay, I'll change based on what Noah thinks. No. Noah was changing himself based on what he knew about God. And so they walked together. What does that imply when people walk together? Hello, anybody out there? Doesn't that imply a closeness, a fellowship? Two people walk together. If you take a walk, who do you want to take a walk with? People you're close to. So yeah, hey, let's take a walk. You don't say to somebody who just irritates the dickens out of you, hey, let's take a walk. unless you only want one of you to come back. I read somewhere that's how Eskimos would get rid of somebody who's causing trouble in the village. They just take them hunting. And they come back, well, a bear got him. Something happened, I don't know. Fell in that hole out there we were hunting seals through or whatever. But Noah walked with God. Who else walked with God according to the text previous to Genesis 6? Enoch. Enoch walked with God. Let's go back and take a look at that. It mentions it twice. In chapter 5. Jared, in verse 18, chapter 5, verse 18, Jared lived 162 years and became the father of Enoch. Then Jared lived 800 years after he became the father of Enoch, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. Enoch lived 65 years, and he became the father of Methuselah. Then Enoch walked with God 300 years after he became the father of Methuselah. He had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So we're told twice that Enoch walked with God. And because he walked with God, God took him. So he must have been a standout character as well. Anybody want a good cough drop? They taste marvelous. A fisherman's friend, I highly recommend them. So Noah walked with God. There was a closeness there. They had a relationship. And when you think about God, who he is, the one who spoke the universe into existence, and he's looking at all these people who he has made in his image, and they all have left his ways. They don't care about him. They don't care about each other. The earth is filled with violence. That's what he mentions twice in chapter 6, that the earth is filled with violence. Every thought, every imagination of their hearts is what? Evil. How often? Continually. It's not like, hey guys, let's take a break and let's not think about evil for about an hour here. No, it was evil continually. That's God's information that he's giving us about the world as it was then. All of the creation created in his image has gone astray except for this one guy, and that one guy walked with the Lord. And here's something we need to remember. The more evil there is in the world, the closer we need to walk with the shepherd. Jesus is our shepherd. We'll talk about that, Lord willing, in the sermon a little bit this morning. And the sheep who are the safest are the ones closest to the shepherd. That just makes sense. And that was true in Noah's day as well. He walked with the Lord, and God saw him as righteous, saw him as blameless, and he found favor in God's eyes. What else about Noah? If you look at Ezekiel, this is interesting, I think, chapter 14 and verse 14. You might be thinking, what in the world are we going to Ezekiel for? But Ezekiel mentions Noah. Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 14. Ezekiel says this: even though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst, by their own righteousness they could only deliver themselves, declares the Lord God. Ezekiel is the prophet in exile. When Ezekiel's prophecy opens, he talks about being by the river Kibar in Babylon. So he's with the Jews after Nebuchadnezzar came on Jerusalem and captured a bunch of Jews and took them off into captivity. And this was typical practice. You take over a nation. When things were limited, you didn't have the resources you wanted. So when you found people in that nation who had ability, who had resources, who had skills and talents, you would take those people to your own nation to help build up your own nation. Anybody know who one of the basic men of our 1960s rocket program was? Anybody? Werner von Braun? Who was he? He was the guy that built the V2s and the V1s over in Germany. So the war's over, we've taken over Germany, and here's this guy with all this rocket knowledge. Hey, let's get him over to the States. And he was one of the primary guys in helping develop NASA's rocket program that put a guy on the moon. So it still works like that to a great extent. So that's what was happening there. And Ezekiel is saying, Jerusalem is so wicked that this is how God sees Jerusalem. Even if Daniel was there and Job and who else? Even if Noah was there. So Noah is one of three guys that God inspires Ezekiel to bring up as a standard of righteousness. That's the standard of righteousness that God's looking for. He's looking for men like Daniel, looking for men like Job, looking for men like Noah. Of all the people in history that could have been mentioned, Noah was one of the three. And he says even if Noah was there with Daniel and Job, those guys could only save themselves by what? By their own righteousness. That's how that worked. He mentions them three other times. In verse 14, that's where he starts. And then he mentions them again in verse 16, not by name, but he says these three men in verse 16. And then again in verse 18, these three men. And then he mentions one more time by name in verse 20. So what Ezekiel is doing is holding Noah up as one of three men who are standards of righteousness. I think that's very significant with regard to how God saw Noah. And then in Hebrews, chapter 11, when God inspired someone to write Hebrews, we don't know who it was specifically. A lot of speculation of whether it was Peter or whether it was Paul. Who knows? Nobody does, except the Lord himself. But this is what the Hebrew writer said about Noah. Verse 7. By faith, Noah being warned by God about things not yet seen. What does that mean, about things not yet seen? How was the earth watered in the first part of its existence? Chapter 2 of Genesis says that a mist rose up from the ground and watered all the earth. We're not told anything different until we're told about the floods in Noah's day, when the fountains of the great deep broke up, but also rain came down from the sky. People hadn't seen that before. So when we read Hebrews 11:7, it makes sense. By faith, Noah being warned by God about things not yet seen. Nobody had seen it rain from the sky. Nobody had seen the great fountains break up like that. Nobody had seen a flood like was in Noah's day. In reverence, the Hebrew writer says, Noah prepared an ark. Now, I hesitate to bring up the name Bill Cosby. But in his day, Bill Cosby did a thing on Noah. Who's here old enough to remember that? Oh boy, nobody remembers it. It was hilarious. He's got these sound effects. He's a vuba, vuba, vuba. That's the saw, vuba. And he says, Noah, who's that? Am I on candid camera? What is this? It was funny. But anyway, at some point down the line, you hear the thunder and the rain, and Noah starts bad-mouthing God. Here, what's going on? I got all these animals to take care of, and my hands are blistered from all this sawing and everything. And anyway, it was hilarious. But that didn't happen because of what it says here. In reverence, Noah prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world. How did Noah condemn the world? It was the contrast. It was the comparison. Haven't you ever been in a class where the teacher graded on the curve? Who did you hate? You hated whoever made the best grade. Why is that? Because that lowers the curve. And that puts you farther down than you would have been if that goober hadn't made such a good grade. What'd you have to make such a good grade for? And so the rest of the world would be looking at Noah going, how you got to be so righteous and good all the time and walk with the Lord? Well, because that was right. But in his righteousness, God can say, look here, fellas, it can be done. You can live by faith. You can live righteously. You can live blamelessly. You can walk with me, but you're not doing it. So because he is, you're condemned. There is a standard of righteousness, and when everybody can live like that and does live like that, then the rest of the world is condemned. This is why This is why when we have friends who are living the ways of the world, they're not comfortable when we don't live like they lived. And that's what Peter wrote about. He said let's go back and read what Peter said. This is the best place to do that. It's I think it's 2 Peter. Oh, nope. 1 Peter chapter 4. First Peter chapter 4, verse 4. In all this, they are surprised that you do not run with them into the same excesses of dissipation. What's dissipation? Dissipation is scattering. If you have good things, if you've got wealth, and instead of using those things properly, you're just scattering them and wasting them, that's what dissipation is. It's the idea of wasting the good that God has given you. You run with the excess of dissipation, and they malign you. Why do they malign you? They malign you because you don't do what they do. You're different. You're goody two-shoes. You're teacher's pet. You're whatever they can name you as being, and cast aspersions on you because you're good, and they're not. And you stand as one who is a judgment of them. You don't mean to. You're not good because you're trying to make other people look bad, but that's just the way it works out. When we lived in Virginia, we had a house on a corner, and just up the street from us, about 4 houses, was an excellent family, members of the church, just great people. But their daughter was out washing their car every day. And I, in contrast, washed mine every September, if it needed it. And I thought, wow, she's making me look bad. But I didn't care, because nobody really cared about what my car looked like. And I washed it a little more than that. But that's kind of the way we look at things somehow. When we see someone who's doing really well, instead of saying, thank you, Lord, that this person's doing really well, we'll look at them, well, that makes me look this way. Well, that's not the right way to think. We should never think in those kinds of terms unless we do it constructively. If we do it in the sense of, well, they're doing really well, but I could do that too. I could be more like that. And people who do well can inspire us to do better if we have the right attitude about it. But sometimes we have the attitude of, well, they're just this way, they're just that way, and they're trying to make up for this. And we find all kinds of horrible reasons for them to be the way they are instead of the good reasons that they're doing what they're doing. And Noah apparently didn't do that. He was a standard of righteousness. He walked with the Lord. He was a man of faith. And that's what the Hebrew writer is saying. By faith, Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world and became what? Became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. What does that mean? An heir. What is an heir? You all know what an inheritor. Yeah, you're an inheritor. You're somebody just waiting for somebody to die. I know it's a funny way to say it, but when somebody has wealth that's going to come to you, you are an heir. There was an heir in the scriptures that Jesus talked about. Remember the 2 sons? The younger son went to the father and said, give me my inheritance now. And somebody pointed out, it's not in the text, but they pointed out, and I thought, well, that's a pretty good thing to point out. It's as if that younger son had said to his dad, I wish you were dead now so I could have what I'm going to get anyway. Just give it to me. And that's what he asked for. He asked for his inheritance, but he asked for it early. And he got it. And what did he do? He did what we were just talking about. Excessive dissipation. He scattered it. He wasted it. That's what he did with his inheritance. But Noah is an heir of what? Hebrews 11:7. He's an heir of what? Righteousness, what does that mean? How is he going to inherit righteousness? Well, does he have his own? He does not have his own. Noah, like every other human being, was flawed. But he was an heir. He was going to inherit righteousness. It's interesting, there's an implication of death with inheriting. Well, who died that I might inherit righteousness? That's Jesus. Jesus died, and he absolved all of our sins by paying for them with his death. This is why when we read in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, when Paul says, what we normally remember is him saying, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. But what he also said was, in the gospel is revealed the righteousness of God. What does that mean, that the gospel reveals the righteousness of God? That means, to me, as I understand it, when we see Christ on the cross, we see God paying for all the sin that he forgives. He didn't forgive sin without paying for it. But in the gospel, in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, we see God paying for the sin that he forgives. If you're going to forgive sin, you got to pay for it. If you had you're in a business and somebody cheats you and you wind up having to take them to court, how just would the judge be if he says to the person who's cheated you, well, I forgive you of this debt? Well, the judge doesn't have any issue with the guy because it's not his debt. But when the judge says, I forgive you of this debt, I'm going to pay the one that you owe. When the judge does that, then he has declared himself righteous in forgiving the debt. And that's what God has done. He forgives us of our sin, but he paid for that sin with his son's life. That's the only way he can forgive you. That's the only way he can forgive me, and that's exactly what he's done. And so when Hebrews mentions Noah as an inheritor of righteousness, Noah's going to get his righteousness exactly the same way you and I do. We inherit it because God has established that as our inheritance through his son and through his son's death. You read Genesis about Noah and you might never think it would come to this, but this is exactly what it comes to because it's all tied together. It's all tied together. Observations, questions, comments? Okay. I hope I've made all that good and clear. Noah was also a preacher of righteousness. If you look at 2 Peter, here's where we go to 2 Peter. Peter is talking about God's ability to bless the righteous and punish the sinners. He says this, 2 Peter chapter 2, look at verse 4. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. And then he goes on from there. What does Genesis not tell us about Noah? Does it say anything about him being a preacher? Not to my knowledge. I haven't found anything where Noah addressed people saying, repent, God's bringing great judgment. That's not in the text of Genesis that I could find. But here it is, Peter, inspired to let us know, to inform us, to give us this information not previously known, that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. So while he was preparing the ark, what else was he doing? He was talking to people. He was letting people know somehow that, hey, and if you think about it, how old was Noah when he had his boys? Do you remember that from last week? He was 500 years old when he had his boys. Well, you talk about family planning. He had time to plan that out, 500 years. But that's what it says. The text in chapter 5 says Noah was 500 years and became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Maybe they were triplets. I don't know. Doesn't talk about them being born individually. But He was 500 years old. This doesn't say that he became a preacher of righteousness as he was building the ark. He might have been a preacher of righteousness all of his life, trying to get people to turn back to God. The context of history would have made that sensible. If the whole world was so wicked and so violent, Noah could well have been one standing up for God the whole time. And maybe his preaching is precisely why God decided, yeah, he's a good guy. He's a man who walks with me. He finds favor in my eyes. All the things that it says about him were based on Noah's life, and we don't always know exactly the details of all of it, like this preaching. When was he a preacher? I've always pictured him preaching while the ark was preparing, but maybe it was even before that. All right. And when we see in 529, going back to this text about Lamech calling Noah, Noah, meaning comfort, he mentions that curse. What curse? The curse that God placed on the ground so that the ground would not produce like it had in the garden, but it would produce thorns and thistles. Lamech mentions that. So apparently God's curse did precisely what he intended it to do. It became a punishment, and in that punishment, a reminder of what sin does. Those thorns and thistles and all the things that the ground produced that it wasn't intended originally to produce took away man's ability to rest. It was hard work. And so when Noah's born, Lamech says, this boy's going to give us comfort. He's going to give us rest, and rest in regard to this curse of the ground. And sure enough, when you go to Genesis 9, and we see Noah and his family getting off of the ark and reestablishing life on earth, this is what it says. Oh, I'm sorry, chapter 8. Chapter 8, verse 20. Noah built an altar to the Lord and took every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. The Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done, while the earth remains. By the way, check out this passage in regard to those who were talking about global warming and climate change and 12 years we're all going to be dead. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So there's one of God's promises right there from the flood. You mean based on this?
Yeah, where he says, while it,
Oh, yes, I see.
does that mean that one day it won't?
Right. But while it does, this is the way it's going to be. It's going to be a regularity. But while it won't, or while it does imply, it's like, you think God had his plan in mind when he was talking to Noah for the end of the world? And the answer to that is, well, duh. Of course he did. He knew that when he brought this world into existence, it wasn't going to be permanent. He brought it into existence, and he had a plan all along for everything. Let's see, the curse. So the curse is lifted. No more curse. So when you go out to tend your garden and you see weeds, they're just weeds. They're not necessarily part of a curse. I've wondered, however, trying to cut my way through briar thickets out in the woods, how many of those briars would not even be there if it hadn't been for the curse? I wonder if there's just a little bit of the curse left, just a little bit, because we do have briars and thorns, and we've got poison ivy and poison oak. We've got things out there that'll make you itch and kill you if you're not careful. So anyway, there you go. There you've got that much. Now, here's something that I think is worth noting. When he lifts the curse in verse 21 of chapter 8, look what he says. I'll never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. Now, wait a minute. Doesn't that sound to you, as it sounds to me, like more of a reason to curse the ground than to remove the curse? Why does God say it like that? Okay, there's a good reason to stick with that argument. But I'm wondering if it's like this. God is saying, as he has in other places, this is the way man is. There's no reason for me to just keep cursing him. He's going to be this way, and he's always going to be, so I'm just going to remove this curse and let him be the way he's going to be. Do you remember in Deuteronomy 24? That's where, through Moses, God allowed the Israelites to divorce. Now, why did he say he allowed them to divorce? Because of the hardness of their hearts. He says, from the beginning it wasn't so. I'm putting Deuteronomy with Matthew 19. And so that was something that wasn't supposed to happen initially, but it's like God says, I understand the way man is, and so I'm going to allow this. Not necessarily his will, but I'm going to allow it because I understand the way people are. And we're the same way. We forgive people for things oftentimes because we see ourselves in what they do. Isn't that true with you? I know it's true with me. Well, yeah, I do the same thing. Somebody gets on your bumper and rides on your bumper on the highway. Man, if I had machine guns, if I had a tail gunner, hey, take that guy out. But how many times have I been on somebody's tail? What's that? They're just drafting, yeah, really. You know what drafting is? You watch NASCAR, all you NASCAR fans, that's where you get up behind a car and there's a little bit of a vacuum back there and you're giving your car all it's got, and you finally get up behind this car with that little vacuum, you've got a burst of speed, and so you catch that burst of speed and you pull out into the lane, boom, you can pull past him because you've drafted. It's all about physics. I think that's what some guys are doing on the interstate sometimes anyway. But where was I going with that? I don't even know. But
We're talking about people doing things that are wrong, and we look at them and we do the same thing.
yes, and it gets back to God saying, I'm not going to curse the ground anymore because this is just the way man is. There's no use for me beating a dead horse. I wonder if that's what kind of the way he's thinking when he says this. I'm not going to curse the ground anymore. He's just that way. Just let it be that way. So, no more curse for the ground. We still have weeds, what we call weeds. We still have some thorns, but it's not like it was. It's not like it was. Noah has come, and through Noah, we have found some rest because in Noah, God removed that curse. And so it's not only Lamech who was looking forward to Noah giving us rest from the curse of the ground. It's us looking back to Noah and saying, what if Noah had not been who he was? Would the ground still be cursed like it was? And would we still be eking out a living? I mean, when you look at those pictures of fields here in Oklahoma and you drive past those and they're just verdantly green with all that wheat and everything else that grows up. You go out to around Canton and a lot of people out there grow canola. Have you ever seen canola in blossom? It's just spectacularly beautiful, big fields of bright yellow. It's excellent. What would that be like if it wasn't for Noah removing that curse through his life and his righteousness? Well, we've had a bell. I'm not really finished with Noah. Just something I want you to consider, just a point of interest, not necessarily anything huge theologically. Noah was 500 years old when he had his boys, right? That's from chapter 5. In what year of Noah's life did the flood come? The 600th year of Noah's life. So that's 100 years. Now, if you look at chapter 6 in verse 3, it says, the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever because he's also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be, what? 120 years. What does that mean? I'm not exactly sure. But at this point, God sets this time reference of 120 years. Now, does he? Oh, now you're talking about the average length of a man's life. If that's what, okay, no, that's all right, that's all right. It's good to consider that, because that sounds like, well, maybe that's what that could mean. I don't think it does, because nobody's life ever averaged 120 years. They lived 900 and some years prior to the flood, and after the flood, they dropped way down. And even in, okay, maybe you're talking about the Psalms where David says, man's life shall be 70, and if by reason of strength, 80. So anybody 80 years and older, you're living on borrowed time, according to David. So I think some of us, based on our behavior, maybe living on borrowed time now. Anyway. That's always been my impression, and that's still my best impression. But here's the thing. If God spoke to Noah at that point, and it doesn't say he did, but if he spoke to him at that 120-year point, what did Noah not have? He didn't have any boys. And so if this is, and I'm just throwing this out to think about, because you can't know. You can't know. But if God says, I'm going to destroy all life on earth, I want you to build an ark, and Noah doesn't have a family yet, and then from that point, if God did tell him at that point, he takes 20 years to say, you know what, I might need some help. Let's start a family, to Mrs. Noah. And 20 years later, they have some boys, and they build the ark. There's so many details left out of this that I would like to know. But at the same time, I'm glad God didn't put them all in, because if he did, as we've talked about before, the Bible would be so huge, we would need a wheelbarrow to carry it around. At any rate, it's just interesting to think about. And I don't want somebody down the road to say to you, well, don't you know that God said it'd be 120 years, and Noah was only 600 when the flood came, and he was 500 when he didn't even have his boys to help him build that ark. No. Be ready for that if it ever happens. Anybody got anything? All right, thank you. Class dismissed.